Hi guys, can you hear me? Yeah, I've got a bit of a problem. What's it called? The electricity has gone at home, so I'm having to do this from my laptop. So it's a bit annoying. So let's yeah, sorry. Yes, I'm going to be slightly confused. Okay, I'm going to be slightly more confused than normal today because I'm working from this from my laptop. I can't believe that like we have a power cut at least once a week for at least half a day. I mean, what's happened to Istanbul? And the amount we pay for electricity, you'd at least think they could give it to us on a regular basis. Okay, I think I've got this set up. So I'll just wait. Oh, I'll start slowly because we've only got an hour. So if I remember correctly, we're going to finish off talking about Marr today. And we're going to talk about, if we have time, we're going to move into Van Gelder. How much did I say about Marr last class? Did we talked a little bit about Marr, yeah? Did we?
I mean, not too little, but I don't think we finished it.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, I'm going to try to not spend all the time on Marr because I think Marr is fairly easy to understand. Sorry, I've got this thing where. Okay. Yeah. So this is from the beginning of Vision. That he introduces. Marr's interested, like someone like Putnam and the kind of philosophical functionalists are trying to offer an account of what cognition is. Cognition is cognitive states are functional states. In some sense, they're in the game of metaphysics. Yeah, so they're interested in the kind of what is question. I think Marr probably buys into the kind of functionalist idea, but he's in a different sort of game. He's in the kind of game of scientific explanation. Yeah. And so he's more interested in what a computational, what an explanation of beings like us is. And he thinks that that what he's offering in psychology is the idea that the most appropriate types of explanation in psychology are computational explanations. And then he offers an account of how one goes about offering, what's involved in offering a computational type of explanation. Now, I think he probably buys into the metaphysics, but I think these two projects can come apart because one might think that the best type of explanation one can give is computational, but you might be agnostic. One might think you don't want to get into the metaphysics. You might think you might have certain anti-realist views about explanation. So you might think that scientific theories don't put you in touch with reality and principle. I don't think Marr has a position like that, but some people in the philosophy of science think that science just is instrumental. So you posit entities in science, and the entities you posit just play a role in theories. And what's important is whether the theories are good at making predictions. Yeah, so you can be, oh, someone's outside in the quad. How's the sound out there? I'd be scared of sitting in, but it's probably nicer, isn't it? The weather's quite nice and.
Yeah, it's nice and it's a bit crowded actually.
Oh yeah, yeah. We started this weekend was the first warm weekend since Ali Jan has been born, so it was the first time in his life that we kind of went and sat outside for fun and kind of met some friends in the park. And it was yeah, it's very exciting. Yeah, so I think spring is finally here in Istanbul. So make most of it. Yeah, so I'm talking about how Putnam is offering this sort of metaphysical account, that Marr's really interested in offering account of what sort of form of explanation is appropriate in psychology, and that can come apart from the metaphysical side of things. You could be an instrumentalist. So an instrumentalist is an anti-realist about scientific theories. So an instrumentalist in science thinks that scientific theories are just tools for making predictions, and that they don't give you any insight into the ultimate nature of reality. Yeah, so this was a view that was quite popular in the 1930s amongst logical positivists. I think today most philosophers of science are sort of scientific realists, that they think we should use science as a guide to what there really is. But you might think that with computational accounts that you might think that human subjects sort of approximate these sort of computational things, and approximating something computational is something that a non-computational system could do in certain circumstances. So I think one can hold a view like Marr's about what form of explanation is the most appropriate form of explanation, and sort of remain neutral on the sort of more metaphysical side of things. Yeah, so that's but in some sense that's what I think about computational models. So I think that if you're going to be a materialist, that actually what the brain is a really complex dynamic system, and neurons are oscillators, and you've got like these webs of oscillators that find stable states. But a system like this may have evolved to approximate a computational system in a normal environment. So it might turn out that computational models appropriately capture something about the system, even though the system isn't a computer. It's just something that's evolved to approximate a computer. Yeah, the computational solution. And I think that's quite plausible. If some of these computational models are useful, this might be a useful way of thinking about them. So Marr, he says, to understand complex informational systems, he makes this distinction between, he starts off by saying, we don't have a problem about having different levels of explanation. So I'm going through, I know we did this last time, but now we've got the text in front of us, I'm just highlighting it. So think of gas in a bottle. What you've really got is a bunch of millions of molecules bouncing around. But one level of description is going to be at the thermodynamic level in terms of temperature, pressure, and the relationship amongst them. Yeah, we don't formulate these by using a large set of equations, one for each of the particles involved. So within science, the idea that we have different levels of description seems quite plausible. And then the idea is that these levels are going to be somehow related to each other. So there's a level of description of a gas, which is a collection of particles, but then we can describe the gas in terms of pressure, density, and temperature. But these notions of temperature, pressure, and density can be cashed out in terms, we understand in general the relationships between temperature, pressure, and density and the behavior of large groups of individual particles. Yeah, so there's some sort of story to tell about the relationship between the various levels. Yeah, so this is the thing about levels. Now, he takes the example of a cash register as a complex system that we might want to explain. And he thinks about, if we're going to explain how a cash register works, there's going to be 3 levels. Yeah, and we did talk about this last time. Yeah, the 3 levels of description, or did we rush that? I can't fully remember.
I think we have talked about it.
Okay, yeah. So I'll just run through it. So we have the what and the why. this is what he calls the computational level of description. Yeah, so we want to know what the register does and why. And when we answer the what question, basically what we're looking for is a sort of function or a mapping. So what the cache register does is addition, and an addition is a mapping from a pair of numbers to a single number. It's a function from a pair of numbers to a single number, and it's a function that has certain abstract properties. Yeah, so this sort of mapping has a bunch of properties, which are it's commutative. Yeah, it doesn't matter which order you do it in. It's associative. Yeah, there's a unique number, 0, which adding has no effect. So there's a bunch of abstract properties that this function has. Now, I take it that the what, saying it's a function that maps a pair of numbers to a single number, and to say it's governed by these abstract properties, isn't really enough to give you addition. Yeah, because we only get the idea of addition when we understand what the cache register is for. Yeah, it's for calculating the price, and ideally how it works is it gives it, if it's working properly, it gives us addition. And then of course, once we've got the what and the why, then there's another description in terms of the algorithms that are used. And in order to have an algorithm, you need representations. So he says this whole argument is what I've called the computational theory of the cache register. So I think it's quite important that the computational theory isn't just the what, it's also the why. Yeah, so I think you only get the idea that what it does is addition if you've got the what and the why. So this whole argument is what I call the computational theory of the cache register. And it contains separate arguments about what is computed and why. Yeah, and the resulting operation is defined uniquely by the constraints it has to satisfy. So I guess in terms of constraints, there are going to be the constraints in terms of the abstract kind of what sort of input is it, what sort of output is it, but also the constraint is another constraint is going to be the why. So I take it with vision that Marr thinks that in vision what we have is a process that maps a pair of two-dimensional retinal images to a 3D model of the world, and to a 3D image, a picture of a 3D layout. And the reason it does this is because it's trying to reproduce an accurate internal representation of the external world. So in some sense, there are two constraints. There's the formal constraint that's getting you from a pair of two-dimensional images to a three-dimensional model. But then then you've got this constraint that's coming from the why, which is the idea that it's supposed to be offering an accurate internal model of the world. Now, I take it when it comes to vision that this is quite implausible, that this is mainly what the vision system does. I take it this model of how the visual system works divides up the brain into the mind into three parts. You have perceptual processing that gives an output, which is a representation of the world. Then you have kind of judgment and decision making, which is somehow central processing. And then you get the output of central processing goes to the motor system, and then some sort of plan of action is formed. So I think this way of thinking about cognition is very modular. As I mentioned before, this view goes together with this sort of Fodor view of modularity, where you have these dedicated systems that have their own inputs and outputs, have their own functions, and they're sort of separate from each other. I take it that a lot of the visual system's main function is immediate action. Yeah, so there are definitely direct links, yeah, from the visual system to action. I take it that the function of the visual system is going to be something like not to create an accurate internal model of the world, but to guide action successfully. Yep. So I think that it's implausible to think that so I think that Marr gets the why question wrong. Yeah, the function of the visual system isn't to produce an accurate, detailed model of the external environment. The function is to guide action. Now, the thought is that, well, in order to do this, one way of guiding action is by introducing some sort of internal model. And I take it here, then it becomes a sort of empirical question. But it seems a lot of action guidance doesn't require the construction of an external model. So one person I think that you probably read if you've taken Uz's class is Rodney Brooks. Did Uz give you that for those? Yeah, so he's a sort of roboticist who's got this very famous slogan that the world is its own best model. Yeah, and so one thing about human minds is that one thing about us is that we're really lazy. Yeah, like one of the key aspects of intelligence is laziness. Yeah, you want to do things as simply and as cheaply as possible. Yeah, and constructing a detailed internal model is just really it's really expensive. Yeah, it's really hard. It takes a lot of resources, and it's not something you're going to need to do unless you need to do it. So kind of Brooks's idea is the world is its own best model. So if you want to know where something is, you don't construct an internal model of the room. You just look over there and find it. Yeah, and so I take it that the idea that the brain or the mind somehow, in order to achieve its goals, constructs a detailed model of the external world is quite implausible. Now, it seems obvious that we do construct some models. So for things like planning, that we clearly have something like internal maps. I don't see my apartment now, but I have a rough idea of the layout of my apartment. So it seems to me that we have all sorts of internal models that are involved in things like planning. Yeah, and it seems that even insects like bees have sort of maps. We've got evidence that rats have internal cognitive maps, and I think it's sort of fairly well understood how these maps work in terms of neuronally. So not only do we know from behavioral evidence that bees, rats, and birds and other animals have internal maps, but we actually kind of have it's one of those areas where we have a fairly good idea how these maps are sort of implemented in terms of neurons. So I'm not claiming that we don't ever produce internal models of the environment. Yeah, but it seems to me that it seems implausible to think that the main function of the environment of the visual system is to create a three-dimensional model of the external world. And one thing that's sort of a bit weird is that, I mean, what is this? How's this internal model supposed to help? Like, why can't we just look at the world? Why can't we just use the layout of the world to guide our action, rather than how does creating another model of the world help in any way? And I think the sort of idea is I think it's pushed into this sort of Cartesian picture. Well, the world's too far away. It's not, the world isn't available to us because it's too far away. But if we have a model of the world inside, that's going to be closer to us. That's going to be kind of available to consciousness because it's, well, where is it? Well, it's inside the Cartesian theater. So it's not obvious to me how this internal model can play a role in the way that the external model can't. Now, you might think that there are certain tasks where you want an internal model. So let's suppose you've got to carry a sofa down the stairs or get it through a doorway. You might think you look at the sofa and then you kind of imagine rotating it. Yeah, and so if you're rotating a shape in your head in order to solve a task, you may think there you're using an internal model. You've got a model of the sofa, a model of the room, a rough model, and then you're working out the best way to move the sofa out of the room. Yeah, so you might think in certain types of planning that we have something like some sort of models can play a role. So you might think that the visual system is such that we're able to kind of extract some simplified models that can play a role in things like mental rotation. But I think in general that if we want to know about the layout of the environment, we just sort of look. Yeah, so it doesn't. It seems to me that the thinking that the idea of the goal of the visual system is to construct an internal model. It seems very implausible to me. It's not clear to, and it's not clear to me how this is supposed to help. Now, I can see how it can help in particular tasks. I also think that, yeah, that as I said before, that his account of the visual system is feed forward. So you get input, and then it goes through it goes forward, it gets processed a bit, and then it gets processed a bit more, then it gets processed a bit more, and then you get output. And it seems to me that this treats perception and the visual system as essentially passive. Yeah, you've got the world acting upon it. You have a bunch of you have a bunch of inputs going into the eyes, and then it's just basically this stuff is processed and moves forward. And it seems that from what we know, that the mind is far more constructive and active in perception than these sort of models suggest. So I think we've got. I think. Yeah. So even if you do want to have a computational account, thinking of it as purely a feed-forward thing from a two-dimensional representation. Now, later on in the semester, we're going to look at some more recent accounts of vision. We're going to look at a little bit of some ideas about predictive processing. And I think these predictive processing accounts are broadly computational. Yeah, but they're not committed to a sort of feed-forward view. But they do understand perception in terms of representation, that they understand it. What they're offering us is an account of sort of transformations. Yeah, so these approaches are computational. So I think computationalism doesn't have to be wedded to a very simple feed-forward view of perception. So according to these predictive mind accounts we're going to look at in a couple of weeks, that basically in perception we form a model of the world, that we do have a model, but this is a prediction. And then what comes forward are what goes down are the predictions. And then the model leads to a predicted input. And then the predicted input is compared to the actual input. And all that's fed forward are error reports, are error signals. So this is a view that is computational, but it's not a feed-forward account of the visual system. Yeah, we start off with the model, and then in some sense predictions are being sent down, and then at each level the predicted input is compared with the actual input, and all that's being sent forward are error reports. Atesh?
Can you hear well, because it's kind of noisy?
Yeah, I can hear.
Okay. So I was gonna ask, if do you think that any non-representational computational account is possible in a way that's promoting direct action and sort of?
So can you have a computational account that isn't tied to representations? And I think yes. So I think there are some people out there trying to do that. So there's been some recent papers that I've glanced at that I haven't read in detail. Like some of these papers are hard. So if you want to read them properly, they're sort of papers you can look at quickly and get the vague idea, but I haven't worked through. But yeah, there's some people who think that like computers themselves it's a mistake to think of them in representational terms, because all they really are syntactic engines. And that basically that yeah, tying computationalism to representationalism, some people think that's a mistake. And so we can think of computers as sort of essentially mechanistic systems. And we kind of interpret them in certain ways. But computers themselves, yeah, there's nothing in the nature of computation where we have to interpret what's going on. Yeah. So I think there are some people who want to have a broader notion of computation to think that you can have a notion of computation that, and I can't remember the names of these people. Maybe one of the papers is called Computation Without Representation. I'm not on my computer now because we've got an electricity power cut. So I can't find any of these papers. Yeah, but I think, so one of the problems with computationalism is that it's not really clear what we mean by a computer. And so, you know, it turns out that anything can be taken to be a computer. So one worry about computationalism is that if you look at how you define what a computation is, it looks like anything implements some computation under some description. So, you know, this represents 2 plus 5, and it falls, and that represents 7. So I've just computed 2 plus 5 equals 7. I don't know, like, but so the problem is that, yeah, so it looks like some people are worried, hold a position that's called pan-computationalism, that everything is computation. And so unless you can limit computation, what it is for something to be a computation in a meaningful way, it looks like the claim that something is computational is not very interesting. Yeah. So yeah, you can separate computation from representation, but then I think you're left with a notion of computation whereby everything is a computation, and to say that cognition is computational ends up not to say very much. Yeah. So I mean, this is not one of the literatures that I've followed. I know it's out there. I've read some of it, but there's a big literature about this. Yeah. So what actually is it that makes an account computational? I take it that most people, when they're talking about computational models, actually very often they think it's this second level, the level of representation and algorithm. Yeah. So we have this second level, which is the level of representation and algorithm. So you need a representation of the input and output of the process. I mean, as I've said before, that I think the biggest problem with computational models of the mind is that the mind is separated from the environment. So you basically, in the model, you separate the organism from the environment. You abstract it from the environment because all you care about the input and the output and what goes on between input and output. And once you've got to this level of description, all of this could occur as if the environment wasn't there. And I think that living beings as such, this is next week, we're going to look at Van Gelder and we're going to look at Nicholson. And I think that living beings as such, that they essentially have an environment, because what it is to be a living being is to engage in metabolic processes, which is to engage in a sort of exchange of energy with the environment. And so that sort of interaction with the environment is an essential part of what it is to be a living being. And then like sort of Searle, weirdly, I take it that cognition is something that living beings do. And I take it that with living beings, you don't have input and output in the same way that you do with a computer. Yeah, this is a sort of abstraction. Yeah, so this is the second level of representation and algorithm. And then we have this third level, the level of implementation. Yeah, and of course, one of the things that's central here is the phenomena of multiple realizability. Yeah, so you can have the same computation and algorithms implemented in all sorts of different devices, and I take it the sort of thought about this methodology is this methodology then cuts off psychology from neuroscience. Psychology is an autonomous discipline that you can do without getting involved in questions about implementation. Yeah, neuroscience is physiology. You've got a radical distinction between psychology and physiology. And physiology just has got to do with the implementation of the stuff that the psychologist studies. Yeah, so if you buy into this, I think this way of thinking about cognition led to a sort of separation between psychology and neuroscience, with the idea that you can do psychology without really worrying about the implementation. As a psychologist, you focus on the top level. Yeah, so he says the important point here is that once again, the same algorithm may be implemented in quite different technologies. Yeah, the child who methodically adds two numbers from left to right, carrying a digit when necessary, may be using the same algorithm that is implemented by the wires and transistors of the cash registers in the neighborhood supermarket. Yeah. Now, I take it that thinking about the child, like, I do think it's right that the child implements an algorithm when they're doing addition. And I think it's true that they probably implement the same algorithm as a mechanical adding device. But I take it that this doesn't tell us anything about what cognition is. It seems to me that the reason the child implements an algorithm is because is because they've been taught to do it. So you know, the rules of arithmetic are something that have been drummed into us at school. So I do think arithmetic is quite clearly the rule-governed manipulation of symbols, and that when we kind of do arithmetic, either in our minds or on paper, we're engaged in the rule-governed manipulation of symbols. But I think with arithmetic, it's quite clear that that's because we've been taught, and arithmetic is something that is a social practice that we've learned, and how we learn arithmetic is we learn arithmetic by manipulating symbols in a rule-governed way. That's basically what we've been taught to do. So I think the fact that arithmetic is governed by our practice is governed by algorithms, I'm not sure how much that tells us about what thought is in general. Yeah, because I think it's quite obvious that arithmetic is a social practice, and that the algorithms have sort of been drummed into us. Yeah, we've spent years of our lives learning how to do this shit. Yeah, yeah, and I think what's clear is the algorithms have been explicitly presented to us. Yeah, we've been taught the rules quite explicitly when it comes to these things. So I think, yeah, that I think with arithmetic, it seems quite clear that yes, human beings can implement algorithms, and they can implement algorithms that can be implemented by other machines. And at least one way of doing that is because we've been explicitly taught the algorithms. Now, it's not obvious to me what this tells us about non-social practices. Eunice?
But also, I think with such a framework in which you just try to find isomorphisms between algorithms and implementations, you can't answer the question why there is such an isomorphism. I mean, what are the causes at the bottom level that result in those implementations of those algorithms? I mean, I think Marr's framework also can't answer such a question. I don't know, what do you think?
Well, so I'm not sure. I mean, So it seems to me arithmetic is one case where we've got something like quite clearly the case of, you know, rule governed manipulations of symbols that can be done by machines and can be done by us. Yeah. Now, of course, for the machines, they're not symbols for the machines. So there is going to be a big difference. So if you have a strongly semantic view of computation, then computers don't do any computation. Yeah, like, you know, if you think computation really, the semantics plays a role there, and it really is representations, if something isn't a representation for a system, then there's a sense in which that system doesn't do computation. So I think there's one sense of computation according to which none of the things we call computers are computers. Yeah. If you just think computation is to be understood purely syntactically, then computation is everywhere and it's fairly cheap. Yeah, and you're not saying very much when you say there's something computational going on. Now, so the maths case, arithmetic is quite simple because the algorithms are explicit and they're parts of social practices. I think where we claim that the visual system is algorithmic, there are algorithms in the visual system. I take it that how this works is that so I take it the sort of main sort of methodology that Marr uses is that you create a model, a computational model of the visual system that uses certain algorithms to get from a pair of images to a three-dimensional model. And then the sort of ideal is that sometimes it goes wrong for us. Sometimes that we use these algorithms to reconstruct an accurate picture of the world. And this works most of the time, but in certain circumstances, when the input is weird, we have a visual illusion. And so the sort of evidence that we're using a particular algorithm is often in the form that we have a model that in some sense, we get a model of, we get a prediction of the sort of illusions that are going to appear. So if we get a system that sort of misrepresents the world, if we get a model that uses a set of algorithms to get from a pair of images or an image to a three-dimensional model, and in some sense makes the same sort of mistakes that we do, yeah, then this is taken to be evidence that we, in some sense, are using the same algorithm. That's basically the sort of, I think, the evidential base for the claim that our visual processing is computational and algorithmic. Yeah, that because if we were accurate all the time, then to create something that gives an accurate representation, it's just, well, how, you know, there's lots of different ways of doing that. But you know, you could just have a projection. Yeah, I don't know. But because we make mistakes, the sort of idea is that we make mistakes, we misrepresent the world in systematic ways. And I take it the sort of main evidence for the sort of, yeah, so this is what Marr talks about on page 249. He says, yeah, so some types of phenomena, we have third level. He says psychophysics is related more directly to the level of algorithm and representation. So the sort of stuff Marr is interested in is at level 2. I take it a lot of stuff, so we talk about Chomsky, we talk about these Bayesian approaches. They tend to be at level 1. They tend to be accounts that give you something about Bayesian optimality, aren't really giving you an account of the algorithms, they're giving you an account of the basic function, the what the system is doing. Yeah, so psychophysics is related more directly to the level of algorithm and representations. And different algorithms tend to fail in radically different ways as they are pushed to the limits of their performance or deprived of critical information. Yeah, so you kind of, the psychophysics, the methodology of psychophysics is you try and work, you assume that the visual system or the system you're looking at is an informational system that is algorithmic. And then you look at anomalies. You push the system, you put the system in very unnatural situations that you don't necessarily find in the natural world and see how it sort of misbehaves. And that can give you a kind of, supposed to give you a better understanding of this is supposed, if you think that it's an algorithmic system, looking at situations in which it misperforms is going to be a good guidance for how the system is actually working when things are going well. Yeah, so you push the system to the limits of its performance, and this is supposed to give you some insight into how it performs when things are going well, because you have the same, and this is a way of testing between different algorithms. Now, I think that if we have time, the last thing we're going to look at is a recent paper in the philosophy of statistics, where there is sort of against tractable models in psychology. So the idea is that in artificial intelligence now, you have these kind of pattern recognizing systems that are very good, because what they do is they have massive over parameterization. So in the good case, they're on target because they have thousands of parameters. Yep. And then if things are a bit unnatural, they just go haywire and they aren't very good. So I think one thing is that I think that it's quite likely, and this guy thinks it's quite likely, that the visual system works like, the visual system, especially at the low level, works like this. It basically, insofar as it is computational, its models have thousands, if not millions, of parameters. Yeah, and so it massively overfits the data, which means that it's very good when the environment is fairly normal. It just is very accurate at getting the environment. In weird environments, it just messes up in all sorts of weird ways. Yeah, and so you might think that if you've got a system that is massive, if the model involves massive numbers of parameters, then you think it might turn out that looking at the bad cases isn't going to give you much insight about how the system behaves in the good cases. And you might think then, if this is how the visual system works, then it might turn out that the interesting questions aren't about what's going on in terms of internal processing, because if the internal models have millions of parameters, they're just going to be you can't really model them. So what may then turn out to be the interesting questions are working out which sort of environments are the sort of environments in which the system behaves normally. And so this is the last thing we're going to be looking at. But I think the sort of methodology in psychophysics is to assume the processing is algorithmic, and to assume that the algorithms have not too many parameters. So you have a set of algorithms, an internal theory, you might think, that is quite simple. And that this simple theory, most of the time, gives us a fairly accurate representation of the world, mapping from two-dimensional image to three-dimensional. In situations where the environment is fairly normal, we're quite good. But in weird situations, we misrepresent things. And so the methodology in psychophysics is we can discover the algorithms by looking at the when we push the system to its limits. Yeah, so and this is sort of Marr's methodology in vision, and I think sort of the yeah. One final thing that according to this sort of method, that you start from the top down. So if you want to do this properly, you have to start off asking the question about the computational level, the what and the why, and only after you've done that can you work your way down. So although algorithms and mechanisms are empirically more accessible, it's the top level, the low level of computational theory, which is critically important from an information processing point of view. Yeah, the reason for this is the nature of computation that underlie perception depends more on the computational problems that have to be solved than on the particular hardware in which their solutions are implemented. So, you know, the difficult stuff is what's done by the kind of computational modelers. And then you've got questions about implementation. And in some sense, maybe, you know, that's, we can put that to one side. So, yeah, so, and to phrase the matter another way, an algorithm is likely to be understood more readily by understanding the nature of the problem being solved than by examining the mechanism and the hardware in which it is embodied. So I think one thing is that it looks like it's not obvious to what degree these sort of approaches are mechanistic. Yeah, you kind of stand back, you have a sort of idealization, you come up with a set of algorithms, and then you sort of try and fit the algorithms to the data. And the data you're most interested in is data about when things go wrong. Yeah, so when the system misrepresents the environment. Yeah, and then your model of the system should be such that it's a set of algorithms that lead to the same types of misrepresentations that your experimental subjects are subject to. Yeah, so that's basically the Marr methodology. And it's really been quite dominant. Yeah, I mean, I think it's becoming slightly less dominant. I think there's much more work now with neuroscientists. This is, yeah.
Could you turn the camera for computer on?
Okay, yeah. Our electricity has come back and Zubaida is teaching in 10 minutes and my computer takes about 10 minutes to warm up. So I just turned it on. Yeah, so that's Marr. I think I said most of this last time, but I think Marr's a big name and it's worth hearing it again. Next class, we're going to talk about Van Gelder. And Van Gelder's sort of fun. If you haven't read it, do try and read it by tomorrow. It's a little bit difficult. So he introduces the idea of a what governor. Who's read this paper already or read it before? The Van Gelder paper. Yeah, so if you haven't read it, do try and start reading it for next class. And he introduces this idea of a what governor. So at the very least, kind of get through the first few pages and just get a little bit of an understanding of what a what governor is. And I think he does a nice job of explaining it. And he's offering us an alternative to this computational approach. Okay, I've got to run now. I think I've said everything I wanted to say about Marr. And I need to run because Zubaida is going to teach in 10 minutes. And last class I talked for too long. And then I only had like 2 minutes. We only had 2 minutes to swap over Alijan. And he sort of freaked out a bit and then cried for the whole of Zubaida's class. So let me go and kind of play with him a bit and take over from Zubaida. And I'll see you in class tomorrow. Ciao.